On a cold March evening in 2019, a damp fog enveloped Seattle, penetrating every corner of the suburban neighborhood of Ballard. That day, as dusk finally settled over the city, the Seattle police received a report from Lisa Grayson, a neighbor of the married couple Martha and David Larson. She stated that she had not seen David for weeks and that his wife, Martha, was behaving strangely and avoided talking about his whereabouts. When the officers arrived at the Larsons' house on 11th Avenue, they noticed a faint chemical smell that grew stronger as they entered the garage. Martha greeted the police officers in a reserved but confident manner. She claimed David had gone on a long work trip to South Korea, leaving her alone. During the conversation, however, the officers noticed that Martha was nervous and her story, although well-rehearsed, seemed unnatural. Suspicion grew. From neighbors, the officers learned that Martha and David had not been getting along for several years. In the last few months before David's disappearance, however, there had been frequent arguments in the house that could be heard through the walls. The neighbors had also noticed that in the weeks before his disappearance, David had said he wanted a divorce and to leave the house. The police decided to search the house and its surroundings. The bedroom and the living room seemed familiar to the police, but in the ground floor bathroom, the walls were freshly painted and newly tiled, which drew the investigators' attention. Inspector John Mills noticed that the smell of chemicals grew stronger near the garage. The officers found that the garage shelves were filled with cement bags, tools, and large plastic containers. Additionally, the officers noted that there were traces of fresh mortar on the concrete floor of the garage. The officers decided to scan the concrete floor with GPR for anomalies. After a careful analysis, they found differences in the density of the concrete layer in the middle of the garage, indicating that it had been recently poured. Convinced of the gravity of the situation, the investigators ordered the concrete in that area to be broken up. As the workers broke through the cement layer, they discovered a large, blood-soaked plastic sheet underneath. Upon further investigation, they came across a human body wrapped in plastic foil and hidden under a layer of concrete. The body was in an advanced state of decomposition, but it was immediately clear from the size and clothing that it was David Larson. The remains were taken to a laboratory for forensic examination. The pathologist found several marks of blunt force trauma on David's head and broken ribs, indicating brutal violence. A preliminary forensic report suggested that David had died from the head injuries and that his body had been hidden under concrete shortly after his death. In parallel, investigators examined Larson's bank accounts and phone records. They discovered that a few days before his alleged disappearance, Martha Larson had purchased 20 bags of cement, plastic sheeting, and construction tools from a local hardware store. She paid with her credit card, and her face was visible on the video recordings. The police analyzed her phone and her messages on social media. In recent months, Martha had frequently spoken with her friends about the difficulties in her marriage and mentioned that she was afraid of losing the house in the event of a divorce. This strengthened the motive for the crime. Martha feared that she would lose her property in a divorce, especially given David's intention to leave the family. The forensic team also confirmed traces of chemicals found on the bathroom floor and in the garage. These substances were used to eliminate biological traces, indicating an attempt to carefully hide the evidence. During the investigation into David Larson's murder, investigators began to gather evidence pointing to the involvement of his wife, Martha. Experts reviewed all of the family's documents and financial transactions and analyzed the calls and messages received from her phone in recent months. The first suspicion was that large purchases of concrete, tools, and plastic wrap were made by Martha within a short period. Investigators discovered that the receipts for cement, shovels, and plastic containers were dated to the weeks before David's alleged disappearance. After evaluating the video recordings from the hardware store, the investigators saw Martha driving up to the store in the family's SUV and loading the bags of cement into the trunk. A few days before this purchase, she had also bought heavy-duty construction gloves, stain remover, and several sets of heavy plastic bags. The police decided to check the internet search history on the Larsons' personal devices. Cybersecurity experts found that in the 2 weeks before the murder, Martha had searched for information on how to cover up decomposition odors and how to perform concrete work at home. She had also visited several websites dealing with the financial division of assets in a divorce. The investigation of these materials became an important piece of evidence for her motive. Meanwhile, forensic experts continued to examine the evidence collected in the home. The clothing found under the concrete layer contained traces of blood that matched David's samples, as well as small particles of cement and earth identical to those on the garage floor. The experts suspected that Martha might have transported her husband's body on a cart that was normally kept in a corner of the garage, on which cement traces were also found. A thorough examination of the cart revealed that the wheels had hair particles and traces of David's blood, as well as micro-samples that matched the composition of the concrete in the area where the body had been hidden. Close relatives and friends of the family were also questioned to determine the nature of the relationship between the couple. Neighbors and acquaintances described the couple as withdrawn and without active social contacts. However, several people stated that arguments and shouting had recently been heard in the Larsons' house. A neighbor, Mark Simons, recalled David approaching him in the parking lot about a month ago and mentioning during the conversation that he felt trapped and was thinking about a divorce. Mark noticed that David looked depressed but did not go into detail. Furthermore, the police investigated the family's financial situation. It turned out that David, an engineer at a large technology company, had recently received a substantial bonus, which was partially deposited into a joint account of the couple. This account held a large sum of money, as well as assets such as a house and a piece of land. This information strengthened the theory of a possible financial motive for the murder, as Martha could have suffered a significant loss of assets in a divorce. While examining personal and business correspondence, investigators came across letters that David had sent to his lawyer in the days before his death. In these letters, he inquired about the terms of the prenuptial agreement and pointed out his property rights. David expressed fear that his wife might try to contest the division of assets in her favor. These letters were an important piece of evidence for the theory of a motive of financial distress and impending divorce. Forensic examinations revealed that the gloves found at the crime scene contained small traces of tissue that matched Martha's DNA, as well as traces of chemicals identical to those found at the scene. The gloves also contained microparticles of paint that matched the composition of the paint on the bathroom walls. The forensic experts suspected that Martha wanted to cover her tracks with the gloves when she struck her husband or covered his body. After a financial motive was confirmed and Martha's DNA was found on the gloves, the investigators decided to intensify their surveillance. In the meantime, the investigation team focused on reviewing the data from her mobile phone. The experts noticed that in the days before David's disappearance, Martha had actively searched for information on how to make concrete harden quickly and how she could cover her tracks at the crime scene. The GPS data showed that she had visited several hardware stores in the outskirts of Seattle and parked her car in suspicious locations, including abandoned parking lots and warehouses not monitored by surveillance cameras. Meanwhile, the investigation of the crime took an increasingly serious turn. By analyzing the video footage, it was possible to reconstruct a timeline of Martha's movements on the day the police believe David was killed. The video shows her driving to the hardware store early in the morning, making purchases, loading materials into the trunk of the SUV, and then driving to her house. About 3 hours later, her vehicle left the house again and drove to an abandoned warehouse complex in the south of the city. The investigators concluded that this area could be crucial for the investigation and sent forensic technicians there for a detailed examination. One of the dusty CCTV cameras installed in the warehouse recorded a scene where Martha's SUV drove into the area and stopped at the end of the back row of warehouses. At first, the investigators could not explain why she would want to park her car in this spot. But then they found concrete residue and small fragments of construction debris identical to those in the Larsons' garage. The experts suspected that Martha had likely planned to dump the body here, but had changed her mind for some reason. Back at the main crime scene, the forensic experts conducted further analyses of the cement slab in the garage. They found traces of impurities under the concrete, which indicated the use of binder additives to accelerate the hardening of the mixture. Furthermore, small metal fragments had been mixed into the mortar to reinforce the structure, which is quite unusual for a domestic application. This confirmed that Martha had intentionally reinforced the concrete to create a strong barrier and conceal the body. At the same time, psychologists and analysts began to create a psychological profile of Martha. They examined her behavior after the alleged murder and found clear signs of indifference. The experts noted that Martha had not tried to file a missing person report for her husband, even though he had not been home for several days. She also had not inquired with his friends and colleagues about his whereabouts. This behavior strengthened the suspicion that Martha had carefully planned her crime and felt no remorse after its execution. The investigators also pointed to the financial manipulations Martha had made shortly after David's disappearance. She transferred a large sum of money from a joint account to her personal account, apparently to secure herself before the divorce proceedings began. Shortly thereafter, she applied to the bank to close some of the joint accounts and to transfer the assets exclusively to her own name, on the grounds that David had allegedly left her and departed for an unknown destination. These steps reinforced the police's assumption that the murder was planned to gain control over the family's financial resources. Further analysis of the financial data led to an interesting discovery. A few days before David's disappearance, a large transfer from an unknown source had been received in Martha's account. The investigators began to investigate where the funds might have come from. After further checks, it turned out that the transfer came from the account of a shell company involved in real estate investments. The documents for this company showed that the actual owner was a close acquaintance of Martha, with whom she was in regular contact via encrypted messages. The investigators searched Martha's apartment and found several documents and checks confirming that she had indeed received money from this acquaintance. In further questioning, they found that this man, Thomas Wilkinson, had helped her create a financial plan and had also advised her on legal matters related to the division of assets. However, it is unlikely that he knew of Martha's true intentions. It is more likely that she concealed her plans from him and used his advice to justify further actions. The investigators realized that while the evidence collected against Martha was compelling, a conclusive proof of her involvement in David's murder was needed for a sure conviction. The forensics team returned to the crime scene and focused on the concrete slab in the garage. They decided to take additional samples to determine the depth of the concrete layer and to find any possible traces that might be found in the hardened material. After a few hours of work, they were able to find a piece of organic tissue under the concrete, which was presumed to be David's. As this was confirmed, a part of the material was sent to the lab for DNA analysis. The results were available a few days later and confirmed that the remains were indeed from David Larson. This discovery enabled the investigators to take action. Armed with a search warrant, investigators searched Martha's apartment and her car and seized her electronic devices, bank records, and reports on insurance claims. Among other things, they found encrypted messages she had exchanged with Thomas Wilkinson, which clearly confirmed her financial and psychological preparation for the crime. The police suspected that Thomas Wilkinson knew nothing of the impending murder, but that his advice was used for the estate and asset division, in which he actively participated. The investigators discovered another strange detail. Martha had taken out a $1 million life insurance policy in David's name just a few months before his disappearance. She also made a one-time payment to avoid monthly payments, which drew the attention of the insurance company. She justified this by saying that her husband was a person with a high stress factor and that the insurance was therefore an important element of their financial future planning. On the day of David's disappearance, Martha filed a payment claim with the insurance company, stating that David had disappeared under mysterious circumstances and would probably never return. The investigators decided to conduct several detailed interviews with David's family and friends to find out who else might have been privy to the family's affairs. Several acquaintances of David confirmed that he had become withdrawn and nervous in the months before his death. One friend noted that David complained about the financial pressure from his wife and was even considering filing for divorce. This information strengthened the theory that the motive for the murder was not only greed, but also the desire to avoid the impending division of property. After the investigators had gathered the necessary information, they charged Martha with first-degree murder. In her initial interrogation, she denied the charges and claimed she had nothing to do with her husband's disappearance. She said they had normal marital problems, but nothing more, however. When the prosecutor presented evidence to the court, including DNA analyses and the report on the financial aspects of her plan, Martha began to show signs of concern. At the first court hearing, the prosecutor presented the theory that Martha had planned the murder to get possession of David's assets and to avoid a divorce proceeding in which she risked losing a significant portion of her wealth. Detailed evidence and witness statements, as well as an analysis of her actions after her husband's murder, revealed a complete picture of a premeditated and brutal crime. Martha's lawyer tried to justify her behavior by claiming her actions were motivated by stress, but none of his arguments could shake the collected evidence. The financial manipulations, the video recordings of her actions in the hardware stores, and the technical data about the location of her phone and car all pointed to a well-thought-out and cold-blooded plan. In the final session, the prosecutor emphasized that even after the murder, Martha continued to try to deceive others by sending messages and pretending that David had simply left the family. The records of her actions at the hardware stores and the purchase of special materials conclusively supported the indictment. The court found Martha guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without parole. Thanks for watching and take care.